The wedding photo smiled back at Clive Braddock from the mantel, but the woman in the frame felt like a stranger. 7 years of marriage, and Melody's eyes had never looked at him the way they did in that old picture. Not anymore. "You're working late again tonight?" she asked, not looking up from her phone as she stirred her coffee. The kitchen smelled like vanilla candles and lies. "Auto body shop doesn't fix itself." Clive grabbed his thermos, the metal dented from years of honest work. His hands were permanently stained with grease, fingernails black no matter how hard he scrubbed. Melody's manicured fingers had stopped touching those hands months ago. She hummed something non-committal, thumb scrolling endlessly. The light from her screen cast shadows across her face, highlighting the new makeup she'd started wearing. Expensive stuff that didn't belong in their modest home on Elm Street. "Rita called yesterday," Melody said suddenly, "about the Henderson property. Big commission if it goes through." Rita Linwood, Melody's colleague at Fairfield Realty. Clive had met her twice, maybe 3 times. Nice enough woman, but something in her eyes suggested she saw more than she let on. That's good. He kissed the top of Melody's head, inhaling the unfamiliar scent of her new shampoo. When had she changed brands? We could use the money. We always need money. The words came out sharper than intended. Clive paused at the door. What's that supposed to mean? Nothing. She finally looked up, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Just tired. Go to work, honey. The endearment felt hollow, like coins rattling in an empty jar. Outside, October air bit through his work jacket. Their neighborhood was the kind where everyone knew your business before you did. Mrs. Patterson was already collecting her mail, probably hoping to catch some gossip. The Hendersons' dog barked from their backyard, same as every morning for the past 5 years. Clive climbed into his pickup truck, a 2008 Ford that groaned to life like an old man getting out of bed. As he backed out of the driveway, he caught sight of Melody through the kitchen window. She was on the phone again, animated in a way she never was with him anymore. The drive to Morrison's auto body took him through downtown Fairfield, Ohio. Population 3,847, according to the sign. The kind of place where everyone's secrets were currency, and the bank of gossip never closed. Past the Dairy Queen, past the farm and fleet, past the Methodist church where his mother was buried. Travis Mehring was already under the hood of a Buick when Clive arrived. His best friend since high school, Travis had the kind of loyalty you couldn't buy and couldn't fake. Grease-stained overalls, calloused hands, and a wife who packed his lunch every day without being asked. "You look like hell," Travis said without looking up. "Thanks for the pep talk. I'm serious, man." "You okay?" Clive grabbed his toolbox from the truck. "Just tired? Melody keeping you up?" There was something in Travis's tone, a careful neutrality that made Clive pause. "What do you mean?" "Nothing." Travis straightened, wiping his hands on a rag. "Just asking. But it wasn't nothing. In a town like Fairfield, nothing was ever nothing." The morning passed in the familiar rhythm of honest work. Rebuilding transmissions, replacing brake pads, fixing what other people had broken. Clive found peace in the logic of machines. Unlike people, cars didn't lie. When something was wrong, you could see it, touch it, fix it. Around noon, Rita Linwood walked into the shop. She wore a navy blazer and carried herself like someone used to closing deals, but her smile seemed nervous. "Clive? I was hoping to catch you." Travis glanced over from the Buick, his expression unreadable. "What can I do for you, Rita?" "It's about Melody." She shifted her weight, designer heels clicking on the concrete floor. "I probably shouldn't say anything, but last week I saw her in Warren County, at that fancy steakhouse off Route 11. Rita's voice dropped. She wasn't alone. Clive's wrench slipped, scraping his knuckles against the engine block. "What do you mean?" "She was with an older man, well-dressed, definitely not you." Rita's eyes held a mixture of concern and something else. Guilt, maybe. They seemed close. The world tilted slightly, like the earth had shifted on its axis. "Close how?" "Holding hands, talking real quiet." Rita touched his arm. "I'm sorry, Clive. I debated whether to tell you, but if it were my husband..." Travis had stopped working entirely, pretending to organize his tools while listening to every word. "Did you recognize him?" Clive's voice sounded strange to his own ears. "No, but he looked familiar. 50s, maybe. Silver hair, expensive suit." Rita bit her lip. "I took a picture." She handed him her phone. The image was grainy, taken from across a parking lot, but there was no mistaking Melody's profile, or the way she leaned into the man beside her, his hand resting possessively on her lower back. Clive stared at the phone until the screen went dark. "I'm sorry," Rita said again. "I thought you should know." After she left, Travis approached slowly, like someone trying not to spook a wounded animal. "Want to talk about it?" "Nothing to talk about." Clive's hands shook as he reached for his tools. "It could be innocent. Could be. Business dinner, something with the Henderson property. Maybe." She would have mentioned it. Travis said nothing. That evening, Clive sat in his truck outside their house, watching Melody through the kitchen window. She was on the phone again, pacing back and forth with the restless energy of someone keeping secrets. Her free hand gestured animatedly, her face animated in a way he hadn't seen in months. When she finally hung up, she stood at the sink for a long moment, staring at her reflection in the dark window. Even from the driveway, Clive could see the guilt written across her features. He waited another 10 minutes before going inside. "How was work?" she asked, the question automatic and hollow. "Fine." He watched her face carefully. "How was yours?" "Busy. The Henderson deal is getting complicated." She turned away, loading dishes into the dishwasher with unnecessary force. "Rita mentioned she might stop by the shop today." So casual, so practiced. "She did." Melody's hand stilled on a coffee mug. "What did she want?" "Just to say hello." The lie sat between them like a third person at the dinner table. That night, Clive lay awake listening to his wife breathe beside him. She slept deeply, the sleep of someone whose conscience had been temporarily quieted. He studied her profile in the dim light filtering through their bedroom curtains, trying to recognize the woman he'd married. When had she started wearing perfume to bed? When had she started charging her phone in the bathroom instead of on the nightstand? When had she stopped saying she loved him? The questions multiplied in the darkness like cancer cells, each one feeding the next. At 3 a.m., Melody's phone buzzed from the bathroom. Once, then again. Clive slipped out of bed and padded across the cold hardwood floor. The phone sat on the counter beside her makeup bag, screen glowing with notifications. 2 text messages from a contact labeled simply S. "Can't stop thinking about today. Jean's suspicious. We need to be more careful. Jean." Melody's Aunt Jean, her mother's sister, married to Stuart Kavanaugh, who owned half the rental properties in Warren County and had a reputation for being handsy with his female tenants. Stuart S. Clive's world shifted again, pieces of a puzzle clicking into place with sickening clarity. The fancy dinners, the new clothes, the distance between them. His wife wasn't just cheating, she was cheating with her own uncle-in-law, a 55-year-old man who'd been family for 20 years. The bathroom suddenly felt too small, the walls pressing in like a coffin. Clive gripped the sink, staring at his reflection in the medicine cabinet mirror. The man looking back was a stranger, hollow-eyed, pale, betrayed. Behind him, Melody stirred in bed, murmuring something in her sleep. Clive deleted the message notifications and crept back to bed, his mind racing. How long had this been going on? How many family dinners had he sat through, making small talk with Stuart while the man smiled and nodded and screwed his wife behind his back? The anger started as a spark in his chest, small and manageable. But as he lay there listening to Melody's steady breathing, it grew, fed by every lie, every evasion, every moment of distance between them. The spark became a flame, the flame became a fire. By morning, it was an inferno. Melody was gone when he woke up, her side of the bed already cold. A note on the kitchen counter explained she had an early showing, but Clive knew better now. He knew where she really was and with whom. At the shop, Travis took one look at his face and poured 2 cups of coffee without being asked. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Something like that." Clive's voice came out rough, like he'd been screaming. Maybe he had, in his dreams. "Want to talk about it now?" Clive pulled out his phone and showed Travis the picture Rita had taken. "Recognize him?" Travis squinted at the screen, then whistled low. "Jesus Christ, that's Stuart Kavanaugh. You know him?" "Know of him. Owns the apartments over on Maple Street. Rich fool with a reputation." Travis looked up sharply. "Wait, isn't he married to Melody's aunt?" "Jean, yeah. Crap, man." "I'm sorry." The sympathy in Travis's voice made something crack inside Clive's chest. He'd been holding himself together through sheer will, but hearing the pity in his best friend's voice nearly broke him. "What are you going to do?" It was a simple question with no simple answer. What did you do when your wife destroyed your marriage, your trust, your sense of reality? When your family wasn't your family anymore? I don't know. But even as he said it, Clive felt something dark and cold settling in his chest. A plan beginning to form, shapeless but determined. That afternoon, he followed Melody. She'd texted that she had showings until late, but Clive knew better. He parked across from the Fairfield Realty office and waited, engine running, hands gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles went white. At 4:30, Melody emerged from the building and got into her Honda Civic. She drove east toward Warren County, toward expensive restaurants and hotel bars where wives cheated on their husbands with family members. Clive followed at a distance, staying back far enough to avoid detection, but close enough to see where she went. The Marriott on Route 11, same place Rita had spotted them. Melody parked near the back entrance and walked inside with the confidence of someone who'd made this trip many times before. 10 minutes later, Stuart Kavanaugh pulled up in a black Mercedes, all silver hair and expensive suit just like Rita had described. He was older than Clive had expected, with the soft look of a man who'd never worked with his hands. The kind of man who seduced younger women with promises and money and lies. Clive sat in his truck and watched them embrace in the hotel lobby through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Stuart's hands wandered freely over Melody's body, possessive and familiar. She laughed at something he said, tilting her head back in a way she hadn't done with Clive in years. They took the elevator to the second floor. Clive waited in the parking lot for 2 hours, watching the windows, imagining what was happening behind the curtains. When they finally emerged, both looked satisfied and relaxed. Stuart kissed her goodbye in full view of anyone who cared to look, his hand cupping her face like she belonged to him. Maybe she did. That night, Clive sat at his kitchen table with a beer and a notebook, making lists. What he knew, what he suspected, what he could prove. The evidence was damning, but circumstantial. Photos from a distance, text messages he couldn't legally access, the word of a colleague who might have misunderstood what she saw. In family court, it might be enough for a divorce, but Clive wanted more than a divorce. He wanted justice. The phone rang, startling him from his thoughts. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize. Hello? Is this Clive Braddock? The voice was older, female, tightly controlled. Who's asking? This is Jean Kavanaugh, Melody's aunt. A pause. I think we need to talk. John suggested they meet at Miller's Diner, a truck stop on the outskirts of town where they were unlikely to run into anyone they knew. Clive arrived first, taking a booth in the back corner where he could see the entire restaurant. Jean Kavanaugh was a small woman with sharp eyes and silver hair pulled back in a tight bun. She wore a wool coat despite the mild weather and clutched a leather purse like it contained state secrets. Thank you for coming, she said, sliding into the booth across from him. What's this about? My husband. Jean's mouth was a thin line. And your wife. The words hung between them like a loaded tool. I don't know what you're talking about. Please. Jean's voice carried the weight of someone who'd run out of patience for lies. I've been married to Stuart for 23 years. I know when he's cheating. A waitress approached with coffee, giving them a moment to compose themselves. When she left, Jean leaned forward. How long have you known? Known what? Don't play games with me, Mr. Braddock. I saw the way you looked at him during Thanksgiving dinner. You know, Thanksgiving dinner. Less than a month ago, the whole family gathered at Jean's house. Clive remembered feeling uncomfortable, like everyone was in on a joke he didn't understand. Stuart had been particularly attentive to Melody, complimenting her dress, refilling her wine glass, finding excuses to touch her shoulder. At the time, Clive had told himself he was being paranoid. How long has it been going on? John's composure cracked slightly. 6 months, maybe longer. He's been more careless lately. Staying out late, lying about business trips, spending money on things he won't explain. Have you confronted him? What would be the point? Stuart always has an explanation for everything. He's a successful businessman, after all. Very convincing. Her voice turned bitter. But I hired a private investigator 3 weeks ago. Clive's pulse quickened. What did he find? John opened her purse and pulled out a manila envelope. See for yourself. The photographs were professional quality, shot with a telephoto lens. Stuart and Melody at the Marriott, at restaurants in neighboring counties, at a cabin in the woods that Clive didn't recognize. In every shot, they looked like lovers, not like uncle and niece-in-law conducting innocent business. There's more. Jean said quietly. The next set of photos showed them entering and leaving a medical building. The timestamp was 2 weeks ago. Fertility clinic, Jean explained. Dr. Morrison's office in Columbus. Clive's world tilted again. Fertility clinic? Your wife is pregnant, Mr. Braddock. About 2 months along, according to the medical records my investigator obtained. Jean's voice was steady, but her hands shook slightly. The timing matches when she and Stuart started meeting regularly. Pregnant, with Stuart's child. The diner suddenly felt too hot, too bright, too loud. Clive gripped the edge of the table, fighting the urge to vomit. Why are you telling me this? Because Stuart destroyed my marriage, and now he's destroying yours. Jean's eyes glittered with unshed tears and something else, something that looked like hunger for revenge. Because men like him never face consequences for what they do. What do you want from me? I want him to pay. The words came out harsh, final. I want them both to pay. Clive studied the older woman across from him, seeing his own rage reflected in her features. Jean Kavanaugh was respectable, church-going, the kind of woman who organized charity drives and hosted book clubs. But betrayal had stripped away her genteel facade, revealing something raw and dangerous underneath. What did you have in mind? Stuart has been stealing from his tenants for years. Keeping security deposits, charging for damages that don't exist, evicting people illegally. Jean's voice dropped to a whisper. I have documentation. Financial records, correspondence, complaints filed with the state. Why haven't you turned him in? Because I'm his wife. Anything I say looks like vindictive divorce proceedings. Jean leaned closer. But if someone else were to provide anonymous tips to the authorities... Clive considered the implications. Financial crimes, housing violations, possible tax evasion, the kind of charges that could destroy a man's reputation and freedom. There's something else, Jean continued. Stuart has been blackmailing some of his tenants. Young women mostly. He offers to reduce their rent in exchange for favors. Sexual favors? Among other things. I have recordings. The scope of Stuart's crimes was staggering. This wasn't just an affair. It was a pattern of carnivory behavior spanning years. Why are you still married to him? Jean's smile was bitter. Where would I go? I'm 54 years old with no career, no money of my own. Everything is in Stuart's name. Her hands clenched around her coffee cup. But if he were to face criminal charges, if his assets were frozen... The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Jean would provide evidence of Stuart's crimes to the authorities through anonymous tips. Clive would handle Melody, exposing the affair and her pregnancy to their families and community. Stuart would face criminal prosecution while his reputation crumbled. Melody would be left pregnant, publicly humiliated, and financially devastated. It was perfectly legal and utterly ruthless. I need time to think, Clive said. Of course. Jean gathered the photographs and slipped them back into her purse. But don't take too long. Stuart is planning to leave his wife soon. He's been liquidating assets, moving money offshore. If we don't act quickly, he'll disappear with everything. How do you know? Because I've been watching him as carefully as he's been watching your wife. Jean stood, leaving a $5 bill on the table. Call me when you've decided. That night, Clive sat in his workshop behind the house, surrounded by the tools and projects that had once brought him peace. Half-finished furniture, engine parts waiting to be rebuilt, the detritus of an honest man's life. On the workbench in front of him lay the photographs Jean had shown him. His wife's betrayal documented in excruciating detail, each image a fresh wound. Melody was pregnant with another man's child, a man old enough to be her father who happened to be married to her aunt. The baby would be Clive's stepchild and Melody's cousin, a genetic and familial catastrophe that would echo through generations, unless he stopped it. The workshop had always been Clive's sanctuary, the place where he came to think and plan and create. Tonight, it felt different, darker. The shadows seemed deeper, the silence more profound. He opened his laptop and began researching Stuart Kavanaugh. Property records, business licenses, court filings. The man had indeed built a small empire of rental properties, but the more Clive dug, the more irregularities he found. Eviction notices filed without proper cause, security deposits never returned, maintenance requests ignored for months. Then he found the complaints. Dozens of them, filed with various state agencies over the past 5 years. Young women claiming maltreatment, discrimination, sexual coercion, all dismissed or settled quietly out of court. Stuart Kavanaugh was exactly the kind of hunter Jean had described. Rich enough to buy his way out of trouble, connected enough to avoid consequences, arrogant enough to believe he was untouchable. But everyone was touchable if you knew where to apply pressure. Clive spent the next 3 hours mapping Stuart's vulnerabilities. His business relationships, his financial interests, his reputation in the community. The man had built his life on a foundation of respectability and fear, but foundations could be undermined. By midnight, Clive had a plan. The next morning, he called in sick to work and drove to Columbus. The fertility clinic where Melody and Stuart had been photographed was in a modern medical complex, all glass and steel and false promises of new beginnings. Clive parked across the street and waited. At 11:30, Melody's Honda Civic pulled into the parking lot. She sat in the car for several minutes, talking on her phone, her face animated with an excitement that cut through Clive like a blade. When she finally hung up, she checked her appearance in the rearview mirror, touching up her lipstick with the care of a woman preparing to see her lover. Stuart's Mercedes arrived 10 minutes later. Clive watched them meet in the parking lot, embracing like teenagers despite the 40-year age difference and the wedding rings they both wore. Stuart placed his hand protectively over Melody's still flat stomach, the gesture so intimate and possessive that Clive had to grip the steering wheel to keep from charging across the street. They disappeared into the medical building together, the happy couple planning their secret future. Clive waited in his truck, mind racing. The pregnancy changed everything. It wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about preventing a child from being born into this twisted situation. A child who would grow up knowing their father was a hunter and their mother was a liar. When Melody and Stuart emerged an hour later, they were both smiling. Stuart pulled her close and kissed her forehead, the gesture so tender and paternal that it made Clive's stomach turn. That evening, Melody came home glowing with an inner light that had nothing to do with her husband. "Good day?" Clive asked from the couch, where he'd been pretending to watch television. "Very good." She moved around the kitchen with unusual energy, humming under her breath. "I closed the Henderson deal. Big commission." Another lie, smooth and practiced. "That's great, honey. We should celebrate." Melody paused, a flicker of guilt crossing her features. "Maybe this weekend. I'm pretty tired tonight." "Of course." "You've been working so hard lately." She looked at him sharply, searching for sarcasm. But Clive kept his expression neutral. After 7 years of marriage, he knew exactly which face to wear. "I think I'll take a bath and go to bed early," she said. "Good idea. You need to take care of yourself." The words carried more weight than she realized. While Melody soaked in the bathtub, Clive sat at his kitchen table and called Jean Kavanaugh. "I'm in," he said when she answered. "I was hoping you'd say that. When do we start?" "Tomorrow. I'll email you everything I have on Stuart's business dealings. You focus on documenting the affair and preparing for the confrontation." "Confrontation?" "This only works if we expose them publicly, force them to admit what they've done in front of people who matter." Jean's voice carried a cold satisfaction. "I'm thinking the family Christmas party, 3 weeks away, everyone will be there." Christmas, the season of forgiveness and family togetherness, turned into a theater of revenge. "What about the pregnancy? What about it?" "She's carrying his child?" "She's carrying the child of a criminal who's about to lose everything." Jean's voice hardened. "That baby will be better off never knowing its father." The logic was brutal, but sound. By the time their plan reached fruition, Stuart would be facing criminal charges and social ostracism. The child would grow up knowing only that their biological father was a man who destroyed families. It was almost merciful. The next 3 weeks passed in a haze of careful planning and cold observation. Clive continued going to work, continued sleeping beside his wife, continued pretending that his world hadn't been shattered beyond repair. But underneath the performance, he was methodically documenting every aspect of Melody and Stuart's affair. He installed a GPS tracker on Melody's car, discovering a pattern of meetings that extended far beyond what he'd initially suspected. Hotels in 3 different counties, restaurants chosen for their distance from Fairfield, even overnight trips disguised as real estate conferences. He photographed her credit card statements, noting charges for expensive lingerie, romantic dinners, and a jewelry store in Columbus where Stuart had apparently bought her a necklace worth more than Clive made in 3 months. Most damning of all, he recorded her phone conversations, Ohio was a one-party consent state, meaning he could legally record any conversation he was party to. When Melody took calls in his presence, thinking he wasn't listening, she revealed details that painted a picture of a relationship far more serious than a simple affair. They were planning a future together. Stuart was going to divorce Jean after the holidays, and Melody was going to leave Clive once the baby was born. They'd discussed moving to Florida, where Stuart had property and connections, where they could start fresh without the baggage of their current lives. Every revelation was another nail in the coffin of Clive's old life. But instead of grief, he felt only a cold determination to ensure their plans never came to fruition. Jean proved to be an invaluable ally. Her documentation of Stuart's financial crimes was meticulous and damning. Bank records showing diverted rent payments, falsified maintenance receipts, tax documents that didn't match reported income. She'd been preparing for this war longer than Clive had realized. "I have been collecting evidence for 2 years," she admitted during one of their clandestine meetings. "I knew eventually I'd need ammunition." "Why didn't you leave him?" "Because leaving would have meant giving up everything and getting nothing in return." Jean's smile was sharp as a blade. "This way, I get everything, and he gets what he deserves." The family Christmas party was held at Jean and Stuart's house, a sprawling colonial in the expensive part of town. Clive had been dreading the event for weeks, knowing he'd have to watch Stuart play the gracious host while secretly planning to steal his wife. But as he and Melody walked up the front steps, Clive felt only anticipation. Tonight, the lies would end. The house was decorated with tasteful elegance, twinkling lights and garland draped over every surface. The scent of pine and cinnamon filled the air, masking the rot underneath. About 30 people had gathered, family, friends, business associates. All the people whose opinions mattered to Stuart and Melody. All the people who would witness their downfall. Stuart greeted them at the door with his usual charm, shaking Clive's hand firmly while his eyes lingered on Melody. She looked radiant in a red dress that showed just a hint of the pregnancy she was hiding, her skin glowing with the secret knowledge of the life growing inside her. "Clive, Melody!" "So glad you could make it." Stuart's voice carried the hearty bonhomie of a successful man entertaining friends. "Melody, you look absolutely stunning tonight." "Thank you, Stuart." Her smile was warm, intimate, the smile of a woman greeting her lover in front of her unsuspecting husband. Clive watched the exchange with the detached interest of a scientist observing specimens. In 3 hours, both of their lives would be in ruins. The evening progressed with painful normalcy. Conversations about holiday plans, complaints about the weather, gossip about local politics. Melody and Stuart were careful not to interact too obviously, but Clive caught the meaningful glances, the casual touches, the private smiles they thought no one else noticed. Jean played her part perfectly, the gracious hostess ensuring everyone's comfort while her marriage crumbled around her. But Clive saw the tension in her shoulders, the tightness around her eyes. She was waiting for the signal. At 9:30, after most of the guests had relaxed with holiday cocktails, Clive stood up in the living room and tapped his knife against his wine glass. "Excuse me, everyone. I'd like to make a toast." The room quieted, faces turning toward him with polite attention. Melody looked puzzled, Stuart slightly annoyed at the interruption. Jean watched from the kitchen doorway, her expression unreadable. "This time of year is about family," Clive began, his voice carrying clearly through the room. "About the people we love, the bonds that hold us together, the trust that makes it all possible." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the gathered guests. Someone called out, "Hear, hear!" But it's also about truth. Clive's voice hardened slightly. "About seeing people for who they really are." Melody shifted uncomfortably, perhaps sensing the change in tone. Stuart frowned, his politician's instincts recognizing a threat. "Some of you know that Melody and I have been having marriage problems," Clive continued. "What you don't know is why." The room went completely silent. Jean moved closer, her eyes bright with anticipation. "6 months ago, my wife began an affair with her uncle-in-law, Stuart Kavanaugh." The words hit the room like a physical blow. Gasps, shocked exclamations, the sound of someone dropping a glass. Melody went white as paper, her hand instinctively moving to her stomach. Stuart stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. "That's enough, Clive. You're drunk, and you're embarrassing yourself." "Am I?" Clive pulled out his phone and held it up. Because I have photographs, hours of recorded conversations, bank records showing Stuart paying for hotel rooms, expensive gifts, even medical appointments. This is ridiculous, Stuart began. Medical appointments at a fertility clinic in Columbus, Clive continued remorselessly, because Melody is pregnant, 2 months along, according to her records. Which makes Stuart the father, since we haven't been intimate in over 3 months. The room erupted. Shocked voices, angry denials, the sound of chairs scraping as people stood up to get a better view of the drama unfolding before them. Melody's mother, Esther, started crying. Someone's teenage daughter was recording everything on her phone. "You son of a witch," Stuart snarled, advancing on Clive. "I'll sue you for slander." "With what money?" Jean's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. "The money you stole from your tenants?" "The money you've been hiding in offshore accounts?" All eyes turned to her as she stepped into the center of the room, her face calm and composed despite the hurricane around her. "I've been married to Stuart for 23 years, and I've been documenting his crimes for the last 2. Sexual maltreatment, financial fraud, tax evasion, money laundering." She pulled a thick manila folder from behind her back. "I turned everything over to the FBI 3 days ago." Stuart's face went from red to gray in seconds. "Jean, what have you done?" "What I should have done years ago." Her voice was steady, final. "They'll be serving warrants tomorrow morning. For your arrest, for seizure of your assets, for search of all your properties." The party had dissolved into complete chaos. Guests gathering their coats and fleeing, family members shouting accusations, Melody sobbing in a corner while her mother tried to comfort her. But Clive felt only a cold satisfaction as he watched Stuart's world collapse in real time. "This isn't over," Stuart said, pointing a shaking finger at Clive. "I'll destroy you for this." "You already tried." Clive's voice was calm, reasonable. "You destroyed my marriage, my trust, my family. But the thing about hitting bottom is that you learn who you really are." He looked around the room at the wreckage of relationships that had been built on lies, at the people whose comfortable assumptions had been shattered in a single evening. "Turns out I'm not the man I thought I was." The police arrived 20 minutes later, called by a neighbor who'd heard the shouting. But by then, most of the guests had fled, leaving only family members in the debris of destroyed lives. Stuart was arrested on the spot when the officers ran his name and discovered the outstanding warrants. He maintained his innocence even as they handcuffed him, shouting about conspiracies and frame jobs until they stuffed him into the back of the squad car. Melody refused to speak to Clive, her sobs echoing through the house as her mother and sister led her away. Before leaving, she turned back once, her eyes meeting his across the ruined living room. "I hate you," she whispered. "I know," he replied. Jean stood in her doorway, watching the police cars disappear into the night. Her house was destroyed, her marriage over, her future uncertain. But she looked more at peace than Clive had ever seen her. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now Stuart goes to prison, and I get half of everything he has left after restitution." She pulled her coat tighter against the December cold. "What about you?" Clive thought about his empty house, his ruined marriage, the child who would grow up never knowing their father was a criminal. "I don't know." "Will you stay in Fairfield?" "For a while." "Someone needs to clean up the mess," Jean nodded slowly. "Messes have a way of cleaning themselves up, given time." The next 6 months passed in a blur of legal proceedings, divorce paperwork, and quiet reconstruction. Stuart pleaded guilty to multiple felonies and was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison. His assets were liquidated to pay restitution to his sufferers, leaving him with nothing but a prison jumpsuit and the memory of what he'd lost. Melody filed for divorce immediately, claiming irreconcilable differences and citing mental cruelty. She fought for alimony, for the house, for half of everything Clive had worked to build, but her credibility was destroyed. The recorded conversations, the documented lies, the public humiliation at the Christmas party, all of it worked against her in court. The pregnancy ended in the 4th month. Melody told people it was a pregnancy loss, but Clive suspected otherwise. The stress of public shame, the financial uncertainty, the reality of raising a criminal's child alone, it had all become too much. She moved in with her mother after the divorce was finalized, taking only her clothes and personal items. The house on Elm Street became Clive's alone, empty and echoing with the ghosts of a marriage that had been dead long before he'd known it. Travis stopped by regularly, bringing beer and company and the kind of loyalty that didn't require explanations. They'd sit in the workshop behind the house, surrounded by half-finished projects and comfortable silence. "You ever wonder if you went too far?" Travis asked one evening, 6 months after the Christmas party. Clive considered the question seriously. "Sometimes, but then I remember what they were planning to do. Still, destroying someone's life. They destroyed their own lives. I just made sure everyone else could see it." Travis nodded slowly. "Fair enough." Jean had moved to Florida after Stewart's sentencing, taking her share of the settlement and disappearing into a new life. She'd sent Clive a postcard once, a picture of a beach at sunset with a simple message on the back. "New beginnings, thank you." The town of Fairfield had absorbed the scandal and moved on, as small towns always did. There was new gossip now, fresh scandals to dissect over coffee and speculation. The Braddock-Kavanaugh affair had become local legend, the cautionary tale parents used to warn their children about the consequences of betrayal. Clive had become something of a folk hero among the wronged husbands of Warren County. Men would approach him at the hardware store or the diner, speaking in low voices about their own suspicions, their own marriages cracking under the weight of secrets. But he offered no advice, no solidarity. What he'd done was specific to his situation, his enemies, his capacity for patient revenge. It wasn't a template for others to follow. One year after the Christmas party, Clive was working late in his shop when a car pulled into his driveway. Through the window, he saw Melody getting out of an unfamiliar sedan, her movements careful and deliberate. She looked older, worn down by the consequences of her choices. The radiant woman who'd glowed with secret pregnancy was gone, replaced by someone harder and more careful. "Hello, Clive?" "Melody." He didn't put down his tools. "What do you want?" "To talk." "To apologize, maybe?" "Little late for that." She stepped into the workshop, looking around at the familiar space where they'd once planned home improvement projects together. "I know what you think of me." "Do you?" "That I'm a hooker, a liar. Someone who threw away a good marriage for an old man with money." Clive finally looked up from his workbench. "Is that what you think?" "I think I was stupid." "I think I was seduced by someone who knew exactly what buttons to push." Melody's voice cracked slightly. "I think I destroyed everything good in my life for a fantasy that was never real." "Stewart's in prison. The fantasy is definitely over. He writes me letters." The admission came out bitter, ashamed. "Even now, he thinks we're going to be together when he gets out, that I'm going to wait for him. Are you? Are you insane?" Melody laughed harshly. "I lost everything because of that man. My marriage, my reputation, my family's respect, even my baby." Clive's hands stilled on his tools. "What happened to the baby? What do you think happened?" "I couldn't bring myself to carry a criminal's child into the world." Tears started down her cheeks. "I told people it was a pregnancy loss because I was too ashamed to admit the truth." The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of choices that couldn't be undone. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you're the only person who knows the whole truth. Because maybe I need someone to understand that I'm not a monster." Melody wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "Because I loved you once, and I threw it away for something that was never real." Clive studied his ex-wife's face, looking for manipulation, for angles, for the lies that had come so easily to her during their marriage. But he saw only exhaustion and genuine regret. "What do you want from me, Melody?" "Nothing. I don't expect forgiveness. And I don't expect you to take me back." She took a shaky breath. "I just wanted you to know that you were right. About everything. Stewart was using me, and I was too stupid to see it until it was too late." "Where are you living now?" "With my mother. Working at a real estate office in Columbus, trying to rebuild my career." She looked around the workshop again. "I drive past the house sometimes. It looks good. You've been taking care of it." "It's my house now." "I know." "I'm glad." Melody moved toward the door, then paused. "For what it's worth, I understand why you did what you did. If someone had destroyed my life the way I destroyed yours, I probably would have done the same thing." After she left, Clive sat in his workshop for a long time, thinking about forgiveness and justice and the weight of choices. Melody's apology didn't change anything. The marriage was still dead, the betrayal still real, the consequences still echoing through both their lives. but it provided a kind of closure he hadn't expected. 2 years after the Christmas party, Clive was having lunch at Miller's diner when he overheard a conversation at the next table. Two women discussing someone named Stewart, who'd been released from prison early for good behavior. His blood ran cold. That evening, he called the federal prison where Stewart had been serving his sentence. After being transferred through several departments, he finally spoke to someone who confirmed his worst fears. Stuart Kavanaugh had been released 3 weeks ago. Good behavior, participation in rehabilitation programs, overcrowding concerns, all the usual reasons why dangerous men were returned to society before their sufferers had healed. Clive hung up the phone and sat in his kitchen, mind racing. Stuart was free, which meant he was dangerous. Men like him didn't accept responsibility for their actions. They blamed others for their downfall. And Clive had been the architect of that downfall. He called Travis first, then Jean in Florida, then even Melody. Everyone needed to know that the monster was loose again. Jean's number went straight to voicemail. Melody answered on the third ring, her voice tight with fear when he explained the situation. "What are we going to do?" "You're going to be careful. Don't go anywhere alone, especially not at night. Don't answer the door unless you know who it is. What about you? I can take care of myself." But even as he said it, Clive felt the old fear creeping back. Stuart was older now, presumably wiser, definitely angrier. He'd had years to plan his revenge, to nurture his resentment, to decide who was responsible for his suffering. The answer came 3 days later, when Clive found his truck's brake lines cut in the parking lot behind Morrison's auto body. If he hadn't been in the habit of checking his vehicle thoroughly, a paranoia left over from the months of documenting Melody's affair, he might have died on his way home that evening. Instead, he called the police and reported the vandalism. They took a report, dusted for fingerprints, and promised to investigate. But Clive knew they'd find nothing useful. Stuart had learned to be careful during his time in prison. That night, Clive loaded his father's old hunting rifle and sat in his living room with the lights off, watching the street through closed curtains. He'd never been a violent man, but 2 years of living with the consequences of other people's violence had changed him. If Stuart wanted a war, he could have one. The attack came a week later, not on Clive, but on Melody. She was leaving her office in Columbus when a car jumped the curb and nearly struck her in the parking lot. The driver wore a baseball cap and sunglasses, but Melody caught enough of his face to be certain it was Stuart. She called Clive in hysteria, barely coherent through her tears. "He tried to eliminate me. He tried to run me down in the parking lot." "Are you hurt?" "No, but he missed me by inches. If I hadn't jumped behind a car..." She dissolved into sobs. "Where are you now?" "At the police station, but they're not taking it seriously. They say it could have been an accident, that I can't prove it was intentional." Clive felt the old, cold fury settling in his chest. "Pack a bag and come here." "Tonight? I can't impose..." "You're not imposing. You're staying alive." Melody arrived at his house 2 hours later, carrying a single suitcase and looking like a woman who'd seen her own passing approaching. She'd lost weight since their conversation in the workshop, her face gaunt with stress and fear. "Thank you," she said simply. "Don't thank me yet. If Stuart's targeting you, that means he's targeting me too." This isn't over. They spent the evening boarding up windows and checking locks, preparing for a siege. Clive showed Melody how to use the rifle, where he'd hidden spare ammunition, which neighbors could be trusted in an emergency. It felt like the old days, when they'd worked together on home improvement projects. Except now, they were preparing for someone to try to eliminate them. "I'm sorry," Melody said as they tested the security system Clive had installed. "This is all my fault. We both made choices. We both have to live with the consequences. But if you hadn't, Stuart would have found someone else to manipulate. Men like him always do." Clive checked the motion sensors around the property. "The only difference is we know what he is now." That night, they slept in shifts, one watching while the other rested. It was the first time they'd been under the same roof in over 2 years, but there was nothing romantic about it. They were two people united by shared danger, nothing more. The final confrontation came at dawn. Clive was making coffee when the motion sensors triggered, their high-pitched whine cutting through the morning quiet. Through the kitchen window, he saw a figure moving through his backyard, carrying what looked like a gasoline can. Stuart was going to burn them out. Wake up! Clive shook Melody roughly. He's here! She jerked awake, instantly alert. Where? Backyard. He's got gasoline. Melody grabbed the rifle while Clive called 911, but they both knew the police wouldn't arrive in time. Stuart had chosen his moment carefully, early enough that most neighbors would still be asleep, late enough that he could see what he was doing. Kitchen window, Melody whispered, pointing. Stuart was splashing gasoline around the foundation of the house, methodical and unhurried. He looked older than Clive remembered, his hair completely gray now, his movements careful. Prison had aged him, but it had also hardened him. Front door, Clive decided. We go out shooting. Are you insane? He's going to burn us alive if we stay here. At least this way we have a chance. They crept to the front door, weapons ready. Clive's hands were steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. He'd been preparing for this moment for years, even if he hadn't realized it. On 3, he whispered. But before he could count down, the smell of gasoline reached them, followed by the sound of breaking glass. Stuart had thrown something through the living room window, a Molotov cocktail that exploded in a burst of flame and smoke. The house was on fire. Back door! Clive shouted over the crackling flames. They ran through the kitchen, but Stuart was waiting for them. He stood in the backyard with a pistol in his hands, his face calm and focused. Hello, Clive. Hello, Melody. They stopped in the doorway, trapped between the advancing fire and the armed man who'd destroyed their lives. Stuart. Clive kept his rifle pointed at the older man's chest. Let her go. This is between you and me. Is it? Stuart's smile was cold, reptilian. Because I seem to remember both of you ruining my life. You ruined your own life. We just made sure everyone else could see it. Perspective, Clive. It's all about perspective. Stuart gestured with his pistol. From my perspective, you conspired with my wife to frame me for crimes I didn't commit. You were blackmailing tenants for Zex? I was offering flexible payment arrangements to tenants who needed help. Stuart's voice remained calm, reasonable. Everything I did was legal and consensual. The man actually believed his own lies. Years in prison hadn't changed him. They'd only convinced him he was the sufferer. Behind them, the fire was spreading through the house, filling the air with smoke and the sound of destruction. Soon the doorway would be impassable. What do you want? Melody asked, her voice surprisingly steady. Justice. Stuart's eyes glittered with madness. I want you to confess that you lied about me. I want you to admit that you seduced me, that you framed me, that you destroyed an innocent man's life. And if we do, then I'll let you burn to end quickly instead of slowly. Clive felt time running out as surely as he felt the heat from the flames behind him. In minutes, the smoke would overcome them even if Stuart didn't shoot them first. You know what? Clive said conversationally. You're right. Stuart blinked, surprised. What? You're absolutely right. We did frame you. Clive took a step forward, the rifle still aimed at Stuart's center mass. We conspired to destroy your life, to take everything you'd built, to leave you with nothing. Clive, what are you doing? Melody whispered. And you know what else? Clive continued, taking another step. It was worth it. Every minute of planning, every lie we told, every piece of evidence we manufactured. Because you're a hunter, Stuart. You're a parasite who feeds on vulnerable women, and the world is better off with you in a cage. Stuart's face twisted with rage. You son of a... He raised the pistol, but Clive was already moving. The rifle cracked once, the bullet taking Stuart in the chest and spinning him around. The older man fell hard, his pistol skittering across the concrete patio. Melody ran to secure the weapon while Clive stood over Stuart's body. The man was still breathing, blood frothing from his lips as he tried to speak. Should have stayed in prison, Clive said quietly. Stuart's eyes widened with understanding and fear as the life drained out of them. He tried to say something, but only blood came out. By the time the fire department arrived, the house was a total loss. The police found Stuart's body in the backyard, along with evidence of arson and attempted homicide. The official report would conclude that Stuart Kavanaugh had died while attempting to eliminate his ex-lover and the man who'd exposed his crimes. Self-defense, clear and simple. Clive and Melody stood in the driveway, wrapped in emergency blankets, watching their past burn to ash. Everything he'd worked for, Everything they'd built together, reduced to smoke and memory. What happens now? Melody asked, her voice hollow. Clive looked at the ruins of his life, then at the woman who'd helped destroy it and who'd ultimately helped save it. Stuart was dead. The threat finally ended. Justice, of a sort, had been served. Now we rebuild, he said. Together? I don't know, maybe. Clive pulled the blanket tighter around his shoulders. We'll see. The insurance settlement came through 6 months later, enough to rebuild the house exactly as it had been. But Clive chose a different design, a fresh start that didn't carry the ghosts of his marriage. Melody moved back to Fairfield after Stuart's passing, renting a small apartment downtown while she rebuilt her real estate career. They saw each other occasionally, at the grocery store, at community events, passing on the street, but they didn't speak beyond polite greetings. The night Stuart died had changed something between them, created a bond forged in shared violence and survival. But it wasn't love, and it wasn't forgiveness. It was simply understanding. 2 years later, on a cold February morning, Clive was reading the newspaper when he came across Stuart's obituary. Someone had finally gotten around to publishing it, probably one of his distant relatives cleaning up loose ends. The obituary described Stuart as a successful businessman who died tragically in an accidental fire. No mention of his crimes, his affairs, or the way he'd really lived. And had sanitized his reputation one final time. Clive folded the newspaper and threw it in the trash. That evening, he drove to the cemetery where Melody's Aunt Jean was buried. She'd died of cancer 6 months after Stuart, taking her secrets to the grave. Her headstone was simple granite with her name, dates, and the inscription, "Beloved wife and mother." Even in N, Jean kept up appearances. "I kept my promise," Clive said to the headstone. He paid for what he did. The wind through the cemetery was cold and final, carrying the scent of snow and endings. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolled the hour. Clive pulled out his phone and called Melody. "Hello?" "It's me. Are you free for dinner?" A pause. "Why?" "Because Stuart's dead, Jean's dead, and we're still alive." Clive looked around the cemetery at all the people who'd run out of time for second chances. "Because maybe it's time to stop being defined by what they did to us." "I don't know if that's possible." "Neither do I. But we won't know unless we try." Another pause, longer this time. "Okay, yes. Dinner sounds good." Clive hung up and walked back to his truck, leaving the dead to their silence. Behind him, Jean's headstone caught the last rays of sunlight, casting a shadow that pointed away from the past and toward whatever came next. The ending wasn't what anyone would call happy. Too much had been destroyed, too many people hurt, too many lies told and retold until the truth was barely recognizable. But it was honest, and it was finished. Stuart Kavanaugh was dead, his crimes exposed and punished. Melody had faced the consequences of her choices and found a way to rebuild. Jean had gotten her revenge, even if it cost her everything. And Clive had learned that justice and revenge were often the same thing, wearing different faces depending on who was keeping score. He drove home through the quiet streets of Fairfield, past the houses where normal people lived normal lives, where marriages survived and children grew up safe and secrets stayed buried. His own house stood at the end of Elm Street, rebuilt and clean, waiting for whatever came next. As he pulled into the driveway, Clive's phone buzzed with a text from Melody. 7:30 at Giuseppe's? He typed back, "See you there." It wasn't forgiveness and it wasn't love, but it was something. A beginning, maybe, or an ending, or just two people who'd survived hell deciding to share a meal. The sun set behind the trees, painting the sky the color of ashes and new beginnings. In the distance, church bells chimed the hour, marking time for the living and the dead alike. Clive Braddock walked into his house, closed the door behind him, and prepared for whatever came next. Outside, the world continued its ancient dance of sin and redemption, justice and revenge, love and betrayal. The story was over. The living could begin. The end.